Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we chat with energy experts from all around the world. We exchange on timely energy issues as well on their life experience. You will learn a lot whether you're an energy aficionado or a newbie. It's March 18, 2022, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today, I'm exchanging with Phillip Cornell, an energy and foreign policy specialist with various experiences in the private and public sector. Phillip is currently principal at the Economist Impact and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He recently wrote a piece on how to sanction Russian energy, mitigate price spikes, and advance low-carbon energy security. So I'm very happy to have him join the podcast to discuss how the ongoing war in Ukraine is impacting the energy sector, and exchange also on the different approaches to exert maximum pressures on Russia right now. Hi, Phillip.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you. So let's delve right into the topic of the day, which is the sanctions and the situation especially between Europe and Russia. So there is this ongoing destructive war in Ukraine, and recent energy sanctions and broader sanctions are already bleeding the Russian economy and crippling its energy sector. Can you walk for us through the different measures that have already been implemented and kind of the state of play right now when it comes to energy and Russia?
Sure, absolutely. We have to start this entire story with the fact of a bloody and gruesome invasion and war of choice on the part of the Russians in Ukraine. I think that this, even despite the buildup and the forewarnings that we heard, particularly from the American administration and American intelligence, was still relatively unexpected. And the difficulty watching this from the sidelines in the West is that we see this bloody, gruesome situation unfold and worsen in a way that, we can't really do as much as we would like. The reality is that for a country that's outside NATO, it would be very difficult to be involved directly, and so this is putting a constraint on what we can do
to avoid a World War III, right?
That's right. In the meantime, what has happened very swiftly after the engagement of conflict was the imposition of really some of the harshest and broadest economic sanctions that we have seen in history. Those started very quickly in the first week of conflict with the imposition of of sanctions that targeted the financial sector, particularly international transactions, access to the SWIFT messaging system, and perhaps most punitively, sanctions on the Russian central bank. Those, I think, went above and beyond, even what Vladimir Putin had expected in terms of financial sanctions, particularly the impositions on things like SWIFT and the central bank. But critically, inside those first round of sanctions was an explicit carve-out for energy transactions. So what does that mean? It meant that those same financial transactions that had been blocked for other trade were given exemptions by the US government and by the Europeans.
So concretely, it means that if Europeans are still importing Russian pipeline gas, let's say, they can still pay Gazprom for this gas.
Exactly. And that's partly because also the financial institutions that are facilitating those transactions, so in your example, Gazprom Bank, were exempted from those sanctions on financial institutions. Why was this? It's because, we're extremely reliant on Russian energy exports. Russia is, one of the top oil and gas exporters, following the U.S. And the top gas exporter. So that means particularly in the case, right, and coal as well. And so particularly in the case of Europe, which relies on Russia for about 40% of its gas imports, even more of its oil imports. Those restrictions on energy flows could have a real impact, not just on prices, as we're already seeing globally, but also on physical shortages of supply. And so those were carved out, particularly in the early days. I think what we saw subsequently was very interesting, which was a groundswell measure among the populace and reflected in political pressure in the US by the US Congress, but also by politicians in other Western countries to restrict the energy revenues that go to the Russian state precisely in order to avoid funding Putin's aggression, particularly as it got worse and worse on our television screens and as we saw evidence of war crimes. And so as we came into sort of the second week in early March, the White House was responding to this pressure from Congress to impose energy sanctions, and in particularly an embargo on Russian energy imports. Actually, the first country to do this was Canada. Canada, of course, which exports very little of all of those materials, so it was rather symbolic. The
You
U.S.
mean import or export?
So Russian exports or
Well, right,
Canadian
and Canadian,
imports
yeah,
they're eventually from Russia.
right. And same, I would say same for the US. I mean, I'm less familiar with oil, but at least for gas, it's the last Russian cargo that landed into Massachusetts was in 2018. It used to be maybe one or two transactions a year. That's it. It's a low cost, it's a symbolic measure, low cost for a country like the US, mentioning gas as banning gas from Russia.
Yeah, gas in particular. Oil, it's a bit different. We had seen sort of rising oil imports in 2021, particularly a few specific Russian oil products. But crude imports were still relatively low. At their height, we were seeing something on the order of a couple of 100,000 barrels per day. As we got into 2022, even before sort of this conflict started, they had gone much lower. So in the first 3 months of 2022, they were as low as sort of 13,500 barrels per day, which is really negligible. That's on the crude side, which is really negligible. So it's true that the impacts on the U.S. market were bound to be relatively small, but that really wasn't the issue about putting on a U.S. embargo. The issue was the pressure that it would put concurrently on Europeans to follow suit.
Did it work?
Well, not really.
Yeah.
The UK got on board with restricting Russian oil imports over a certain time period, but not immediately. And in the European case, no, it didn't work. And why is that? Particularly because of resistance from some Central European countries, and really we're looking at Germany here. And why is that? It's because I think there is a concern that given the heavy dependence on Russian imports of energy, the potential link between an export embargo, let's say an embargo on Russian imports to, let's say, Germany on the side of oil, that could spill over into other consequences, including a possible Russian imposed ban on their own exports of oil and possibly gas to Germany, which would have a very high impact on the European economy and potentially on the solidarity of those countries and the support of German voters for action in Ukraine. I think what's very interesting.
You're saying that if Europe were to decide to ban in a limited way, or pick basically what they would ban, they could face a retaliation from Russia that could decide to stop everything.
That's one of the questions that's on the table, and I think whenever we consider taking energy sanctions, energy ban, Russia has been very clear and has made an effort to emphasize, as you might expect that they would, that those measures are tantamount to economic war and that they are going to retaliate in full. Now, we have to take those obviously with some grain of salt, because we can expect that they would say that. But certainly how Russia reacts is one part of this equation. So, even though the Europeans didn't get on board, and I would say that followed some very serious negotiations and diplomacy on the part of the US administration to coordinate with European allies, which they've done with a lot of effort over this entire affair. The Europeans are not ready at this point to sanction Russian energy. But there are alternative options out there.
So you're thinking about the piece you wrote about the punitive levy on Russian energy. So explain us, because in your opinion, it would be a good way to mitigate also the impact on European consumers, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So given that now we are seeing pressure from European voters to take part in some kind of sanctioning of Russian energy and to cut off those flows of revenue to the Kremlin and to, frankly, the Russian war machine, it's important to think about, okay, now what are options out there that we can impose short of an embargo? And one idea that I floated in this article that's being discussed in various circles is the option of a punitive levy or essentially a punitive tariff on Russian energy imports, and starting with Russian oil imports as an alternative to an embargo. So the goal of that would really be to divert those revenues, extract the rent from those purchases, but continue to allow the molecules and the oil to flow to the European market. Oil proceeds from Europe to Russia total over $250 million per day. Those have gone down a bit recently due to self-sanctioning in the market. So, currently companies, for reputational reasons and to avoid potential impacts of sanctions, many of them have refused to trade in Russian oil products. Many shipping companies have refused to carry them or to go to Russian ports in the Black Sea. So we're already seeing restrictions and actually barrels that are being locked in as a result of self-sanctioning. But particularly for pipeline oil through the Druzhba, which carries, of about 2.5+ million barrels a day of Russian crude that was flowing to Europe previously, that accounts for about 700 plus thousand barrels per day. That has continued to flow. So the point of a tariff would be to say, okay, we can impose this tariff of a certain percentage. Now, the percentage at which you impose it would have to be that which the Russian sellers would continue to sell. But let's say something, on the order of 30 to 50% tariff on Russian imports. And
so it would be the national governments, like European governments, let's say, that would agree in a coordinated way to apply this punitive tax. And so they would be the one deciding the amount.
That's right. So obviously, as a rule, greater unity around this kind of policy would create more effectiveness, and it would limit the alternative buyers for those Russian cargoes. So if this can be accomplished on a European basis, that would be, I think, sort of the primary goal. And in that case, it would be levied the way that other sort of European tariffs are levied, which means that national customs services are the enforcers, but it could be levied on a European basis.
But does it mean that you need the agreement also from the oil traders, the refiners, like all the different players involved in the oil market?
So, in order to impose this kind of levy, you wouldn't need necessarily the agreement of those refiners, but of course the conversation with the oil industry needs to be at the center of all of this. And because of the quality issues around Russian crude, it's particularly heavy and sour. There's particular European refiners in places like Germany and Austria that are optimized for that kind of crude. It may hit some refiners differently than others. And so in that sense, yes, you would want to have ongoing conversations with those refiners and with the industry. But eventually, the point would be here that particularly for seaborne cargoes on the spot market, that tariff would be considered during the price negotiation of a barrel. And because of the relative elasticities of oil on the demand and the supply side, we calculate that most of that levy would end up being paid by the Russian seller. And so because many European refiners, particularly on a collective basis, would have alternative sources of oil, and Russians would have less choice about where they could divert, particularly Urals crude, that they would either have to shut in many of those barrels or they would have to pay this tariff. And so then we start talking about what are the various options for different Russian barrels to actually find alternative buyers. In practice, those would be in China, in India, and collectively on the Asian market. Because of, let's say, transport logistics hindrances, probably, and this has been calculated by Goldman Sachs research, for example, about 40 plus percent of those Russian exports could be able to find alternative buyers on a daily basis, partly because we're limited in terms of how you can divert piped oil to tankers, the increased sailing time to get to Asian markets, and the increased discount and the limitations of which buyers, even in Asia, would want to accept those barrels.
And would we set a precedent with this kind of punitive levy? And some other suppliers may fear that, one day, not all of the OPEC suppliers are democratic country, far from that. So how would they perceive this punitive levy?
I think it's a fair point because, what we're doing here finally is differentiating between oil from one supplier versus oil from another supplier, and then using and then putting a tariff on that particular oil. So certainly you can see that I think this could cause maybe some concern among other suppliers, but it's also, sending a message about what kind of limitations or what kind of tools are at disposal of Western buyers when it comes to, let's say, particularly unpalatable political decisions like war and invasion. I think what we would have to emphasize with this kind of tool is that it is a one-off punitive measure. It's not the beginning of a mercantilist, let's say, economic strategy around energy.
And would you need to track every single spot cargo from Russia and monitor where they are going? Yeah,
it's notorious. I think, Leslie, as you probably know, it's notoriously difficult to track individual molecules through the entire supply chain and know exactly which country they came from. And inevitably, even among Western trading houses, there is the possibility for leakage. There's the possibility of say, lack of a better word, laundering some of that oil and selling it under a different banner. But for the most part, this would cause a significant imposition on Russian cargoes, and it would really eat into the discount at which Russian barrels are selling, with or without the tariff, even in places where the tariff isn't imposed. So the point here is really, how do we maximize the rent that we can extract from each of those barrels that finally makes its way back to Russian exporters and finally to the Kremlin, while keeping the flows of those barrels going. But there's a lot of questions that are up in the air, not just the technical issues of which barrels make it out, how many make it in, how do we actually enforce it, I think, which are legitimate. But critically, and this goes back to the point you made earlier, how do the Russians react? And I think that's sort of the major X factor here, but also one that we should be careful not to wring our hands too much over. I think this is, at the end of the day, a political move as well as an economic one. And politically, the point that if, for example, the reaction from either Rosneft or the Kremlin was to say, okay, we're going to react by cutting off all energy cargoes, well, then it's on the Russians, and they've started this embargo, and I think that is more than an academic debate.
So there is a lot of discussion now about diversifying supply, moving away from the Russian dependence, especially for Europe. Nobody knows how long the war will last, but how long those energy sanctions will last, and what would energy sanction de-escalation will look like. We know that potentially this war is going to change how Europe sees its resource-rich neighbor and deal with its energy. But we know also that in the past, Europe has shown a lot of inertia and burst of motivation that end very fast. In your mind, what would when would this levy, if it were applied, would end, and what do we do with the sanctions? And we know that Europe is going to pay huge costs, socially, economically. So, is it realistic to think that they will last forever?
Uh, I mean, I don't think they would last forever. Again, I think the point of these kinds of measures are to be very clear that they're in the place of an embargo and they're in place as a punitive sanctions for particular actions. I think your point about finding the off ramp and what does de-escalation look like is really key. And the point about any kind of sanctions is to decide and be very clear about what is the goal of those sanctions. What are the objectives, and how do we determine when sanctions relief happens to provide exactly those off ramps? I think it makes sense to say that relieving energy sanctions would probably provide early elements that would be taken off earlier than other sanctions. Why? Partly, as you mentioned, to relieve pressure on the global and European economy, which would likely happen in any case, but also because they would be particularly important to the Russians in order to facilitate recovery in their own economy. And so, in terms of what are the sanctions that stay on for a long time, I think some of the other goods whose trade and value to the economy are actually products of its energy economy itself would probably be some of the ones that would last forever, but not this one. Let me just say, though, that over the longer run, and this plays into your earlier comment, there is a greater sort of mega trend going on here, and that's the risk of, let's say, deglobalization broadly, but specifically greater trade barriers that we're going to start to see for many different reasons, right? Whether it's for geopolitical and security reasons, whether it's for energy transition or carbon reduction reasons in the case of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And overall, there is this trend that we're seeing towards deglobalization. And, for one of the latest Economist edition, we've identified sort of $3 trillion that is at risk from diverted investment just as a result of greater imposition to international trade and investment. So there is a larger cost here and trend that we do need to keep in mind. But in the case of war and violence, I think, we're talking about specific situations.
Good. Well, let's move to your personal and professional trajectory, Philip. So, according to your words, you have a classical trajectory. So, I want to hear more about that for somebody who worked in the policy and security space. So, you work for the World Bank, for the International Energy Agency, Aramco, NATO, Dow Jones. But you also had an experience, I think, in a startup with something that has nothing to do with your consulting expertise. So tell us a little bit more about your path.
Yeah, absolutely, Leslie. So, when I left graduate school, I started working in international organizations, starting at NATO, working on energy security policy for the alliance, which suddenly seems very relevant looking back from the other end of my career.
I know it came
And
back. It came back from
oh yeah,
from yeah, from the Trump era, I would say. Yeah.
oh, that's right. I mean, I'll tell you, my first job at NATO was looking at complex interdependent energy systems and trying to figure out where there were sort of cascading failures within the global energy system that could be exploited on a security basis. So those conversations are very much in vogue again. But from there, it was being involved in international energy and security diplomacy. It was followed by work at the International Energy Agency, first doing simulations of large energy supply disruptions and running simulations and wargaming among ministries to react to that. And then finally advising two of the executive directors of the IEA subsequently for sort of broadly on energy policy within the IEA. And so from there also to Aramco, I would say that my career was classical in the sense that it was, a march and a trajectory through some of the large policy organizations around some of these big questions. And then into Aramco, similarly, a very large market maker and an integrated energy company that was undergoing a transformation in terms of expanding its international footprint, expanding down the oil and gas value chain, and also undergoing efforts to expand into things like renewable energy and alternative energies. So all of those were super interesting and gave me sort of a view into different sides of the international energy business and into different fuels, and also just sort of an interesting front row view to major changes in the oil economy, particularly through the last decade, from one of let's say oil scarcity or supply concerns in 2008, 2009, to one of energy abundance, the rise of unconventional oil and gas, the response from Middle East producers, and finally the transformation of the entire industry to respond to energy transition.
Yeah. I can
But
relate to that on the gas side. Exactly the same.
very much on
Same
the gas
period.
side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you lived also in many different countries.
Well, and this was the benefit, yes.
Yeah.
So when I was at NATO, I was based in Germany and often in Brussels. The IEA is clearly based in Paris, but was operating and advising all around the world. And then I was living in Dhahran and in Bahrain during my time in the Middle East. So altogether, this was something like 15 years abroad, working in various roles in international energy. But in 2016, I came back to the US and came back to Washington. I took a non-resident senior fellowship at the Atlantic Council in preparation for changes in the US administration and US policy. Like many people, I didn't expect the outcome of the 2016 election in the US. And as a result, found myself, I think, like many people in Washington, thinking about what were next steps. And while the energy questions around policy continued to be extremely interesting in 2017 and 2018, and I continued to be involved through my work at the Atlantic Council in some critical discussions, when life throws you a curveball, you play ball. So I thought that this was also a great opportunity to explore other interests. And part of that was the startup that you mentioned. I had a good friend of mine in California that I had known since I was young that was a product designer. And we got together and had been talking and discussing about changes going on in the aviation industry. And we launched a product on aircraft interiors. And suddenly I found myself, traveling around to trade shows, developing a physical product, launching, conducting sales pitches with investors, with large airlines and engineering groups. And so it was a completely different world than the one I had known professionally during my energy career. But it taught me a lot of lessons, that the experience in some of those large bureaucracies, looking at energy from a market perspective, from a policy perspective, from an analytical perspective, didn't afford me, right? So it was sort of the everyday of starting a business, funding a business, getting financing, and getting a new product off the ground. So it was really exciting.
Good. So would you become an entrepreneur again?
Well, I can tell you, it's as well as being very exciting and very fun. It's also an emotional roller coaster, and one that I certainly wanted to experience. We had a good deal of success with this product. I think, like a lot of companies and like a lot of people, the onset of COVID in 2020 threw life threw me another curveball.
Right.
And again, I think, particularly after having spent time in these large institutions, learning how to be agile, to confront
Reinvent
different
yourself. Yeah.
changes, reinvent yourself, change tack, was certainly very interesting as well. And during that time, finding a balance. So I was consulting at the World Bank, I think, as you mentioned, while also continuing to find buyers and an external partner for the startup. So trying to mix those two worlds, I think, at the end is the most exciting. And at the end, I found myself in a media organization. So who knows, Leslie? Clearly, reinvention and agility takes on a new twist once again.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have you back soon. We'll see what's happening with the sanctions, and maybe we'll have, I hope, one day a chat about de-escalation.
Thank you so much, Leslie. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Thank you. This episode was recorded on March 18, 2022. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.